Okay, hi everyone. I welcome you back for the afternoon sessions. I'm Aditi and I'm a postdoctoral fellow here. I hope you all had a good lunch and are back energized for the next exciting sessions that we have. In this session, we have our first speaker as Professor Anne Dremel. She is affiliated with University of Bonn, Germany. Prior to that, she was also an assistant professor at TU Eindhoven, Netherlands, and also did a postdoc there. She did her PhD from Utrecht University, Netherlands. Her research interests revolve around discrete and computational geometry, data structures for geometric objects, trajectory time series analysis. Today we'll hear her talk about finding complex patterns in trajectory data. Please join me in welcoming Professor Rennie.
Thank you for this nice introduction, and also thanks to the organizers for organizing this nice workshop. It's really a pleasure to be here. I hope everyone can hear me also in the back. Yeah, this seems to be working. Okay, so I want to talk about trajectory analysis, and I have the pleasure to motivate this topic because it's the first talk on this topic. And so I want to start with some pictures of trajectories. And basically these two quite different areas, behavioral analysis and Earth system analysis. Because I'm involved in projects on these two topics, and so they actually also have quite a lot in common, because in both of them trajectories play a large role. So you can think of, so whenever you have some object that's moving or something that's moving, you want to track it, or some system that's kind of evolving over time, then you can make a time series or trajectory out of it. So you can think of someone like walking around making movements, and you track the positions of the joints, and you get a trajectory in high dimensions, or just like the 2D positions of migrating animals or on the sports field. And analyzing this type of data, we want to learn more about movement, maybe detection and prediction of movements. On the other side, these are, for example, hurricane trajectories, or trajectories of little buoys that float on the surface of the ocean. And oceanographers, they are interested in finding out more about the structure of the ocean by studying this type of trajectories. And there's actually also a numerical, so you also have this Lagrangian analysis where you track particles like through some system, and like you get these kind of pictures there as well. So this is just like to say that trajectories are everywhere, and what we want to do is we want to solve kind of basic data analysis problems on this type of data. And one of the most fundamental problems is a clustering problem. But before we can define this, we have to kind of define the similarity, or we have to define some distance metric for comparing, to say when are two trajectories or two curves similar or dissimilar. And for that, it seems to be a very popular distance metric, the Fréchet distance, which is just defined for parameterized curves. But so we can start by saying, okay, mostly when we measure a trajectory, we have this sequence of points, sequence of measurements, and then we can just piecewise linearly interpolate them one after another, and we get a polygonal curve. And we can also interpret this as a parameterized curve. We say, okay, we parameterize from the 0-1 interval. So this might seem a bit technical now, but it will be important later, so please pay attention. So we can just parameterize them with some parameterization intervals, so the simplest interval is just 0-1 interval. And then, so I guess the Fréchet distance is kind of one of the most natural distance measures that you can think of for saying when are two curves similar. Well, we're interested in the trace of the curve, so what you see here actually, and we're not so much interested in the parameterization of it. And what the Fréchet distance does is it says, okay, what if I just can just look at all possible reparameterizations that are orientation preserving, then what are the two representations, or one representation that makes one curve closest to each other, to the other one. So if I walk along it with this parameter t, and I look at the distance along the two curves, and I want those to be as close as possible for the entire time, then what's the smallest possible distance with which I can traverse both curves?
It's important that the reparameterizing f is strictly increasing, like it cannot be saturated.
So it's actually not that important. So here I wrote it as an int sub, but you can also write it as a min max, and so it's actually not that important. We can look at it in a minute, or maybe yeah, maybe it's a slice that it's actually not very important. But you can. It doesn't really matter if you say it's strictly increasing or not, if you would require it. Right, so then the question is, okay, can you actually compute this? Yes, so even though you're optimizing over this infinite set of reparameterizations, you can, so it turns out you can look at this free space diagram, which is the joint parametric space, so of the two curves. And every point in here where the two corresponding points, P, S, and Q of T, whenever these two are close to each other within a fixed threshold value, delta, and you say, okay, this is a part of the free space. And now I'm interested if there exists a monotone path, a path that is monotone in both parameters, S and T, that only stays within the free space. So here, for example, it could be that there is a path if I choose the delta like this. But it's not a monotone path. If I make delta a little bit bigger, then there's a monotone path. And that would be the delta where the Fréchet is attained. And now you can say, okay, decision problem for a fixed delta. You can now solve this using just going through this space in like a dynamic programming fashion. And because in every cell here, the free space is convex, you don't really care what's happening inside. You only look at the intersection with the edges of the grid cell.
It's like a variational characterization.
I'm not sure. Maybe we can talk about it afterwards. And then you can optimize over delta. And there's also a discrete variant of this. So if you like this better, you can also say, okay, I don't really care about what happens on the edges. I only care about the actual measurements, and maybe I assume that the curve is very densely sampled. So this just this piecewise, so just going from here to here directly, that represents my curve well enough. And then I have like a discrete version of this free space matrix where, which we call free space matrix, where I say, okay, if two points are close, then I put a 1, otherwise a 0, and then I want to know is there a path that is monotone in both parameters. Okay, just a warning. So yes, the discrete Fréchet distance approximates a continuous Fréchet distance if you have enough, if your curves are sampled densely enough. And otherwise you get some additive approximation that depends on the edge length.
The m is the number of points, like this. What is m?
So here, so here this m is the number of the length of the number of points along the curve. So if you so let's say you have a signal and you're sampling it, and then you let m go to infinity, then you convert to the continuous Fréchet distance. Actually, no. So okay, the better way to say it, you kind of resample along these edges, and then you converge towards the continuous Fréchet distance of the polygonal curves. So that's the correct thing. Yes. Okay, but sometimes it's so it's more beneficial to look at the discrete variant, because when the problem turns out to be too hard for the continuous variant, then maybe we can still say something for this variant. Okay, now the problem we want to study is clustering. So if you go back to basic principles, what's the most fundamental clustering problem? Where we start with a minimum closing ball. We can say, okay, this is well defined in any metric space. If I have a set of points in a metric space, then what's the point that minimizes the maximum distance to all of these points? That's the center of the minimum enclosing ball. And so yeah, and for K center is a clustering problem where we basically say, okay, what if I have K minimum closing balls? I can group those points. What's the best way to group them to to minimize the radius of these, the maximum radius of these minimum opposing balls. That's one way to think of it, the case-center problem. And now we have a little twist, because we don't want to study the case-center problem. That might also be an interesting problem under the Fréchet distance, but we also want the curves, the center curves, to not be too complex. So because if we just pick them from the metric space, they could have a very like rough shape, and they could so it could lead to an overfitting problem, because yeah, so if you have this simple example here, so let's say A and B is my input, then the center curve looks like this. So it has this bump and has this bump to stay as close as possible to like to minimize the radius. And yeah, I can extend this to many curves that each only have constant complexity, but the complexity of my center curve actually goes up. So it has the same complexity as my input data set, which is not so nice if you want to use your cluster centers to represent a set and to kind of summarize the overall structure. So that's why we like to, so we define this KI center problem where L, this parameter, gives you like a budget, like a maximum number of vertices you can use for each center curve. Okay. So there's quite simple algorithm for this, approximation algorithm. So this is like an extension of the Gonzalez algorithm. You just pick a curve, and then we simplify it because we only can use curves of complexity k. So I didn't define what this L simplification is. So L simplification is just a some curve that has at most L vertices, but it has the smallest possible Fréchet distance to P. That's an L simplification of P. That's what we choose as our first center curve. And then we always look which curve maximizes the distance to the current set of centers that we picked, and then simplify it and add it, and so on. So this iterate this until we have k-center curves, and this gives us 3 approximations. So which you can see, so just for one center it's quite easy, it's by triangle inequality, because we say, okay, assume we can compute an optimal L simplification, then, well, any center curve has this error, so that's where you get the instead of a 2 approximation, a 3 approximation, because it's plus r. And for k centers, you can think of like the k plus 1. So you think of adding the last curve that defines your cost. You think of that one as well, and then you have k plus 1 curves, and they have to fit into k clusters. And because of the way you chose them, it's this decreasing sequence. The costs always decrease, and every pair of centers that you have picked before, they have actually this distance at least to each other of the current cost that you have. And so then there have to be at least 2 in optimal clustering, and then you can apply the same argument. Okay, so this is nice, but then, okay, how good is this actually? So 3 approximations may not be what we were hoping for, but we can also show that problem is NP hard, and it's also hard to approximate. And I just want to sketch this very quickly, because it kind of gives a little bit of the gist also of why the problem is difficult.
It's hard because k-center is hard. Your curve could be a single point.
So it's hard even in 1 dimension. So when the curves are in 1 dimension, and it's hard even if k is equal to 1.
So that separates it from.
Yes, so it's much harder than k-center in the metric space. And what we do is, yeah?
So I was wondering if there is any trade-off known for the values of k and L, because intuitively it feels that if you keep increasing k, then with smaller L, one can still simplify another way.
So there is, so the question is, what about k and L? Is there like a relation, or like, can you trade off one for the other?
Yes.
And that's very reasonable. So you could say I have like a total budget of points, and now I can choose as many clusters as I like, but then in total the number of vertices used for my cluster centers should be not more than that. So yes, so there is, I think, like a called L budget, some other variant that was also defined later that is also studied. that. So we found it easier to define it like this. It's much more structured. Yeah. Okay, so shortest common supersequence. You give an n sequences, and let's say you can just assume there's over binary alphabet, and you want to compute the shortest possible sequence that contains all of these sequences as subsequences. So for example, you could have these three sequences here, and this could be your super sequence, so it contains all of these as subsequences, and it's the shortest possible sequence that has this property. Now we want to do a reduction, we want to encode any possible instance like this, and what we do is, so these are curves these are one-dimensional curves, but I draw them so that we can actually see the structure. I draw them like function graphs, so the current relation is on this axis. And then what we have these gadgets where we say, okay, we replace an A basically with something going down, and we replace a B with something going up. And then we have these extra wiggles before and after, and they have the function of being able to skip over letters of the center sequence. So here, the red curve is my super sequence, and this is kind of idealized center curve. That's what it could look like. You still have to prove that it doesn't diverge too much from this in the optimal solution, which you can. And then, so these letters are in, and then for these that I want to skip, I use these little ones, which I can do at any point. And yeah, so this is what it looks like when you skip over letters for the other ones. Okay, so so this is just the first part of my talk. I actually want to talk about another problem, but just to wrap up. So we have so we were wondering, okay, how robust is this NP hardness reduction, and it's pretty robust. So here for yes, so for discrete Fréchet distance, we get very close to the factor 3. And in fact, I think we can also improve this with recent results, but it's not really written down. So this should be more like very close to 3. And if you go to higher dimensions, then here, so this slide is a bit old, there's a factor 6 here because we were using our approximation algorithms for the simplification, but this, you couldn't also think of this as being more like a 3. So there is now also there's now also simplification algorithms in higher dimensions for Fréchet distance that can give you the exact result. The running time is not quite the same, but yeah. So basically, we have these constant factor polynomial time algorithms, and okay, this is a special case when the curves are at 1D. You can also do 1 plus epsilon with some a high dependency on these parameters k and l, but if you think of them as being parameters, like if you set them, say, they should be constant or so, then this is also quite fast. Yeah, but so not really dwelling on this too much, because actually what I promised that we want to talk about is the subtrajectory clustering problem. And there we don't have this nice picture where all the curves kind of have the start and the end, and we just want to, they more or less start in the same position, end in the same position, and we want to cluster the entire curve. So here in this picture, there are these homing pigeons that are released, and then here's the home. So some of them don't want to come home, but yeah. So those are like outliers, but most of them like go home, and we want to know, okay, which path do they take? And but usually the data that I showed you in the beginning doesn't have this nice structure. Usually you just start recording, it's like you're happy when you have attached the tracker to the bird, and then you just keep it running. It keeps collecting data, and there could be many trips like this in the data. So if you look at like road traffic data, there could be many trips from like home to groceries or somewhere else. Or even if you just look at one soccer player during one game, they could go back and forth many times. And you're really interested actually in finding these kind of restricting these curves to subintervals, so that you have a nice clustered structure, but where they are in the curve, you don't know. And this is what you want the clustering algorithm to find, right? So, and I hope in the end we have a little bit of time to also look at their applications, some experiments here of this drifter data. If you run clustering algorithms on them to find subtrajectories, you can find something like this. You can see, okay, here there is some number of so some passage, some ocean current that is more or less kind of stable, where lots of these buoys make this movement, and that's what you want the algorithm to find. Okay? Or here you have this tracking of full body movement, and there are many repeated sequences in here, and you want the algorithm to break that down, like segment it into frequent patterns that are repeating. And for both of these applications, the same algorithm works basically.
But you still have timestamp on the take the 0 to 1 parameterization is still there.
Yes, so you just parameterize this entire thing with 0 to 1, and now you want to find these subintervals of the parameterization so that you get a nice cluster structure. And I will get to the exact problem definition in a minute. Basically what we want to do, we want to define a set cover problem. Okay, so set cover, if you remember, most of you probably know what set cover is, but let me define it. Maybe this is a little bit of a technical way of defining it, but it will make sense in a minute. Okay, one way to think of set cover is you're given a bipartite graph. You think of one of the two sets as the ground set, and the other set, those are the sets. The neighborhood of this point, that's the set that's encoded by V4. So this defines the set system, and in set cover you want to find minimum size subset of these sets, so that everything on the left is covered. Okay. You can also take the dual perspective, just switch the roles of U and V. So now this is the ground set, and here you define sets in the same way. And then look at the hitting set, where you want to find smallest possible subset of the ground set, so that any set contains at least one of these. Then it's exactly the same problem. So here S, what was the solution before, is also a solution for hitting set. And this helps us, this kind of perspective, because so I said we want to find these intervals, these subtrajectories, and so it doesn't have a nice discrete structure like this. So so looking at the dual perspective can help us to actually discretize. So for example, if you think of K-center again, or Euclidean K-center, let's say look at decision problems where you have a fixed radius, you want to know, can I cover my set with K disk of this fixed radius, or let's say unit radius. Now I don't have a discrete set system. So I have one set is infinite because the centers I can pick anywhere here in the plane. But if I look at the dual perspective, so I put a disk around every input point, then this disk gives me all the possible centers, so that the disk would contain this point. And then I get an arrangement, a subdivision into cells. So, and within every cell, if I put it, doesn't matter where I put the center in the cells, it's basically just combinatorially just one disk that I could place anywhere there. So then I get a discrete set system from this already, and we're going to use some techniques like this actually for our problem. So here finally there's the problem definition, and it goes as follows. So we're given a curve P, and now we want to define a set system on this. The set system is defined. So this is so a set is defined by some curve, for example this curve Q, and it contains all the points on P that are contained in a subcurve that lies in the metric ball of centered at Q. So here everything on this subcurve here lies in my set defined by Q. But for example this one here, it goes in the wrong direction, it's not in the metric ball, these are not contained in this set. Right, so I just take the union over all of these subcurves, all of the points on these subcurves, and I can look at it in the parameter space, and then I want to cover all of P. Okay. And now we do a trick again, because this problem is quite difficult. We want to be more in a more constrained space. what we do first of all is we simplify our input curve. So we already did that. So you saw that already in the KS clustering algorithm. And then we evaluate our set cover. We actually take our candidates only from this simplification, so subcurves of the simplification, basically of the curve itself. And then we, so that's not in the set, but we also, so we also evaluate it on this simplification. And then we can think of it in the free space diagram. So this is the problem that we have. So let's say we have this simplification of P with itself, the free space diagram of the curve with itself. And now we want to find some sub intervals here, so that if I take the union over all possible paths here, I project them down, this union should cover all P. Okay? And we're not quite discrete yet because we still have an infinite number of candidates along this curve. I can start anywhere and end anywhere. But we managed to show that there are some important points along the curve. We call them extremal points. And the idea is basically, okay, if I take any interval like this, what if I try to move these starting endpoints so that I don't lose any of the coverage? So in some situations, like if the free space looks like this, it's quite easy. You just go as far as possible to the left, as far as possible to the right, and then this would be a good candidate for using in your solution. But the free space diagram could also look quite different. It could also be inverted like this, and then it's more complicated. But
So you need these cards to be monotone, right? Each of these subcards.
yes, so these paths have to be monotone. Yes.
Which means that this delta has to be defined arbitrarily. How do you take this delta? Like, does that they are monotones?
The delta is just fixed, so it's part of it. It's just given with the input. Yeah.
But then these cards may not be monotone.
So the delta just tells you where these lines are. That's the free space diagram. That's you can think of it as a level set of the height function on this parametric space. And so delta just fixes this shape, and then we're looking for monotone curves. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So then, so we could show there's only like cubic number of candidates that you have to look at by combining these extremal points, and then we want to use an algorithm for hitting set, and because our center curves are quite restricted, so maybe I go back. We're interested in long center curves, but actually we can trade off the length of the center curves a little bit with the size of the solution for the hitting set or the set cover. Because if I have a cluster, I don't really have a good picture of a cluster. If I have a long cluster, I can also split it at any point, and then I get two clusters. I cover the same, but and that way I can make my center curves more less complex. And essentially, in the end, it's actually sufficient to look just at center curves that are line segments if I allow enough approximation in the number of sets that I use. And so we were looking at this specific problem where what if my center curves are just line segments? So that means, so because also here we have a restriction on the complexity of the center curves. And then we could show that this set system has low VC dimension. Okay, VC dimension is a property of a set system. So it's the smallest possible size of a set in the set system that so that this set can be shattered. And shattered just means that when you restrict the set system to this set, then it should still contain all possible subsets. Okay? So, or another way to think of it is so a set is shattered if you can represent any subset of S by intersection with some set from your set system. Yeah. So, for example, we see the dimension of the set of rectangles in R2 is 4 because well, I can represent any, instead of 4 points, I can represent any subset by intersection of rectangle, but if I have 5 points, then there's always some set that I cannot represent. So here, for example, in this case, the set that only contains those 4 points on the outside, but not the point on the inside, doesn't exist, and if the points lie in slightly, essentially this is like you can always kind of reduce it to this case to show that there's no set of size 5 or larger that can be shadowed. And so the VC dimension is a very useful property because you can get hitting set algorithms, polynomial time hitting set algorithms that have better approximation factor than log n. Log n, usually this is what's the best you can get in the worst case for set cover or hitting set, but for low VC dimension you can get better. And so that for that we can use the epsilon net theorem by Hauser and Welser. The epsilon net theorem says, okay, if you have a set system with VC dimension delta, then just taking a small sample, uniform sample, depending on delta, the size, and epsilon, then you get what's called, with good probability, you get an epsilon net. And an epsilon net is basically a hitting set. Not quite. So it's only if you can ignore small sets. So it hits every set that has size at least an epsilon fraction of the ground set. And using this, there's an algorithm, it's called multiplicative weight update, where just in log n rounds you can repeatedly reweight your set and always take compute epsilon net, and at some point after log n rounds you know that with good probability you will have a hitting set, and epsilon net will be a hitting set. Okay, so we want to use this algorithm, but then we still need to prove something about the VC dimension. And so I'm skipping over a lot of details, but essentially what we can show is if our cluster centers are line segments, then we can think of the, it kind of behaves like rectangles, or it's actually more like constant union of rectangles. So what do we have to do in the algorithm, or what is the set system we have to look at? So we're doing hitting sets, so we have to look at the dual set. So before, the set that I defined was this union over the subcurves, the points on these subcurves, and now we have to look at the dual set, but what does it actually look like? Okay, let's look at a point T on the curve and think about all possible cluster centers that contain this point. And let's restrict ourselves just to sub-segments of this edge E. Okay. It boils down to T being on a monotone path, or being crossed by a monotone path, in the free space diagram of this curve and the edge E. And so if you just look at this example, for example, here, so let's say you have these 3 edges, and T is on the middle edge, then there's not so much that can happen. So, so actually the space of kind of start and end points of monotone paths that contain T, that go through this middle vertical line T is a rectangle, right? So because you get this independence from this edge to this edge, so any point here in this alpha interval can be combined with, okay, almost any point in this beta interval. So at some point you switch the direction, but that's just the same as taking the diagonal, everything below the diagonal, and remove it. So yeah, so you can do that, or you can say, oh, I include those candidates that are backwards, and that simplifies a lot of cases actually. So yeah, so maybe I should be more precise. So I said we're only looking at these subcurves. We're taking these subcurves as candidates and everything backwards as well. And that gets rid of a lot of annoying cases when the free space is kind of oriented backwards. And then we have these nice rectangles. And by the properties that we have from our simplification algorithm, and so there's only a constant number of configurations. So there's a nice idea by Mark de Berg that so-called maximally simplified curves which have this property that okay, you cannot remove any point. The error would increase too much, and any point that you remove, the error would increase too much. And it has this nice property that any edge that you put close to the curve, you look at the subcurves that are within distance delta. The delta relates to the simplification parameter. It only spans at most 3 edges on the simplification. So then we only have constant number of configurations you have to look there, and so then you get a nice structure in this parameter space, and essentially get low VC dimension, which is similar to the low VC dimension you get for rectangles. And so then when we use this algorithm, we actually get linear and n running time, but also has dependency on the arc length, so relative arc length. So lambda is the length of the curve, and delta is this radius that our cluster radius. So that's a bit annoying. We couldn't really get rid of that. And approximation factor is for small k and L is smaller than log n. And that's why we use the whole VC dimension things. But we can also say, okay, what if we don't use that hitting set algorithm? It's actually not very practical anyway. What if we just greedy set cover and then say, okay, we use log n approximation factor, maybe that's still good enough in practice. And so we can see actually we get much better results. The running time is higher, but there's also this analysis for CFAC curves. So there's like some model of curves that are nicely well behaved, and then you can still be linear in n if you can assume that the C is small. For some data sets, this might be the case, but but these running times are otherwise quite high. But in practice, actually, the algorithm is quite fast if you do some optimization. So here's some results that we just use greedy set. We use our candidate generation together with greedy set cover, and we're so we're quite competitive in terms of accuracy compared to other algorithms that try to solve the same problem. But we're much faster in running time here. So we're here at the bottom. So it seems to work well, even though in this problem you want to have a segmentation of the curve, so you don't really want to have any overlap, right? But we're allowing overlap. We just do set cover, but this is not really a problem. So there's some parts here are black. That's where we don't know exactly. So there's some overlap, but even in the ground truth, the annotators, there's always some transition, right? And the algorithm seems to avoid this overlap quite well. So that doesn't really seem to be much of an issue. And we also applied it to large data sets. So there's this drifter data sets. These are these buoys that are drifting on the surface of the ocean. They are there's very many of them, and this is an international project that's been running for some decades, and each of those has owned by some country. You can see on the map which country owns which drifter. So I guess it has some. There's some issues there that you maybe you don't want other countries' buoys not to get too close to you. But this is like a big project where many countries are involved. There's a lot of data. Where at this point we cannot process all of the data. It would be nice to process all of it. But we can process maybe 1 or 2 years worth of this data, and I don't have, so it's 1 million data points that we can process, and we get maps like this that show us kind of where these currents go, and they seem to align well with what oceanographers think where those streams are. But actually, most importantly, what's interesting for us is the running time. So here, in this data set, because the data set is so well distributed, and we're doing some, we put a lot of engineering in this. Looks like the runtime is more close to linear, so it's more like n to the 1.2 if you measure it in practice. It's not like n to the 3, what our algorithms were predicted, what our worst case analysis predicted. So this is nice. Maybe it would be nice to analyze this also more in theory. maybe the CPACness already says something to this. I'm not sure, but yeah. So this is kind of the end of my talk, and I think I'm well in time. Thank you.
Any questions?
I have a question on the last slide. So I'm trying to understand what the clusters are trying to would represent here. They represent like a bunch of these drifters having similar movement, and that's which corresponds to a current. Or?
Yeah, so it's kind of like this, right? So we take these drifters, and we only care about the orientation, but not the actual time. So not time of day also. So because the parameterization gets rid of that. And then you can also look at, if you have a center like this, then you can look, okay, what does its set look like? And that's what is shown in blue. So there are sub-curves of these drifters. So here there are like a couple of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 or so drifters that have gone through this area in exactly the same geolocation and at different points in time. Yeah. So there are these large streams. So maybe so you probably read about this in newspaper. There are some big currents where a lot of trash is collected. And so we know where those are, but there are other kind of static streams that stay there more or less, or maybe they're seasonal, but this is what your oceanographers are interested in, where those structures, it's kind of a visualization method for this data. Yeah.
So in that case, kind of a follow-up. So how does that compare to maybe like a 2D field-based analysis?
Yes, it's a very good question. Yeah. So we can get very long trajectories, right? So if you do like a vector field, then you're just looking at the position and where's the direction, and you're losing this context a little bit. So we are trying to find longer patterns. Yeah. Yes.
Any more questions? If not, let's thank the speaker once again. It's not a total. And she got her PhD from Free University of Berlin. She specializes in computational geometry and clustering of geometric trajectory data. Today she will tell us about distance measures for geometric graphs. Please join me in welcoming Professor Michael.
Okay, thank you very much. So today I would like to talk to you about distance measures for geometric graphs. So in many applications we encounter geometric graphs, so very often, for instance, as road networks. And in many of these applications the geometric graphs need to be compared. So my personal motivation for looking at this is actually similar to Anne's motivation from studying trajectory data on road networks. So nowadays there's a lot of, as Anne just told you, there's a lot of trajectory data that is being produced by people or animals or vehicles being tracked. And in particular, we get this kind of data on road networks. And then, so here, for instance, you see some part of Athens and some trajectories, just a small set of trajectories on Athens. And if you get really large data sets like this, you can, you can wonder, cannot you also reconstruct the network from this trajectory data? And this is a problem that is called map construction. And by now there are a number of algorithms that do map constructions, and we also worked on this problem and developed an algorithm for map construction. So this is one possible output to a map construction algorithm. So Let me go back. So here's the trajectory data. It's already colored for some pre-processing, actually some subtrajectory clustering, as Anna was doing. And then from the subtrajectory clusters, we can extract the network segments. But then the question is, so, I mean, this is just one approach. There are several approaches to map construction. So now we would like to claim that we get a good reconstruction of the network. So for that, I need to compare the reconstructed network either with the ground truth, so some underlying network that I know is correct, or if I have two reconstructions, I might want to compare them to each other. So how do I compare them? For that, I would need a distance measure, and a distance measure that is suitable for this. So what do we expect our distance measures to do? So definitely it should capture a partial similarity, because so here say I want to compare my reconstruction to the ground truth. So but I've only reconstructed a part of the network because my trajectories were only traversing a part of the network. So I definitely want to have a partial similarity measure that measures my reconstruction to a part of the network. It would be nice to get an explicit mapping of my reconstruction to the ground truth to know, I mean, which are the streets that I actually reconstructed. This mapping may not need to be one-to-one. So one issue that occurs in map constructions, if you have highways and parallel roads, that in the reconstructions they may get made into one road, or maybe if you have highways with separate lanes, they might be reconstructed as separate roads. So I will not ask for one-to-one mapping of my reconstruction to the ground truth. And I would like my similarity measure to capture both the geometric embedding and actually also the topology of the graph. So let me show you here just this very small zoomed out example. So here we have, it's not so well to see, but we have some trajectories that traverse the ground truth, and here are two possible reconstructions, and both of the reconstructions make an error. So if it's not clearly visible here, but so actually the trajectories use this as a four-way crossing. So this reconstruction kind of gets the geometry correct, but it does a topological error because it cannot go straight in the horizontal way. And here, I mean, the topology is correct, but it does a geometric bump. So, and I would like my similarity measure to capture both of these errors. So to notice if my reconstruction is making either of these errors. So there are many measures for comparing abstract graphs, so any form of isomorphism or edit distances, but there are not that many actually that capture both geometry and topology. So here are some. So there's an edit distance for geometric graphs, but that's actually hard to compute. There's a graph sampling distance. Then there's something that's called contour tree distance, which is defined only for trees. There's something called a traversal distance, and then what we suggested was, and we called it the strong and weak graph distance. So I would now like to introduce these two distance measures and to tell you some of their properties and how to compute them. So the strong and weak graph distance are both inspired by the Fréchet distance. So the Fréchet distance, as Anne just told you, is a great distance measures for curves. And the idea of the Fréchet distance is it works via the reparameterizations of the curves, but there's this continuous mapping going on. So our idea was that we also want to map one graph to the other graph, but now we're directly mapping graph to graph. So you can also think of embedding the one graph into the other graph. So a central notion is the notion of a graph mapping. So we are mapping one graph to the other graph. So I'm always mapping the blue G1 to the red G2. So, and I map G1 onto G2 by mapping the vertices of G1 onto points of edges of G2. So I'm mapping into the embedding of G2. And then every edge of G1 is mapped to a simple path between the points its vertices are mapped to in G2. So for instance, in this very simple example, so for instance in light blue, I might like this vertex can be mapped to this point, and this vertex to this point, and then this edge is mapped to this edge. Okay. So that's the graph mapping, and now I use this to define the strong and weak graph distance. So basically what I'm doing, and this is again Fréchet inspired, so I take the best possible mapping. So I find the best possible mapping from G1 to G2, and then I take the maximum distance, and for maximum distance I now take the maximum over all edges of the first graph, and then I take a distance between the edge and its image, so the simple path, so for instance this edge and its simple path, and now I have as objects an edge and a simple path, and to measure the distance between the edge and the simple path I use the Fréchet distance because I like it, and because it's a natural measure for the curves. And I use either the normal Fréchet distance, which we just heard about, or the weak Fréchet distance, which there's a variation which I will tell you about in a minute. So then I call the resulting distance measure on the graphs the weak graph distance if I'm using the weak Fréchet distance on the edges, or the strong graph distance if I'm using the normal Fréchet distance. Yes?
So, the definition you give,
Yes.
couldn't I have just replaced it by a continuous map? Because
Yes.
anyway you are mapping.
It's a continuous, yes.
So this all 2 points can be clubbed into one sentence. It's a continuous map.
Yes. For you, yes. Yes.
And there is no other. It need not be bijective. Need not be subjective. Need not be injective.
Yes. Yes. But it's nice for me. So first of all,
Okay.
it's also, yes. It's nice because I can state the definition in this sense, and it's also nice for people who haven't thought about continuous maps on graphs so much to see this. Yes, but you're right, yes. Okay, so since I am using, so I will not show you any free spaces, I think. So I'm only using this Fréchet distance as a tool for mapping distances between edges and paths. But let me briefly introduce the Fréchet distance. So I only need to, yes?
Just one question. So these red vertices are always mapped to the nearest edge, or?
Okay, so I'm doing on this slide, I'm doing directed distance. So it's a directed distance from the one graph into the other graph. So it's like Hausdorff. Hausdorff distance on points, it's also directed, and you have the two directions. So I will in a minute also do the same as for Hausdorff. I will say that if I want an undirected distance, I take the maximum of the two directions. So here I have the directed distance of G1 to G2, and then I can also do the other direction. But I may only, so my motivation is also, I may only want to do the one direction if I want to measure the similarity of the reconstruction to the ground truth, then I only do one direction, yes.
Excuse me?
Yes,
Can all the blue vertices go to the same point?
they can, yes. 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 So, Fréchet distance, Anna already told you about. I have the two curves, and I look at homeomorphisms on the parameter space, and I reparameterize the curves best possible, and which you can always think of if you have the two curves. Then you can think of 2 points, or if you would like to, you can think of a man and a dog moving on these two curves and always staying as close as possible. Yeah? So that's the Fréchet distance. And then there's a weak Fréchet distance where in the intuition, man or dog are allowed to walk backwards on their respective curves, which means in the formal definitions I don't use homeomorphisms, but I reparameterize both curves by surjective continuous maps. And then here comes the picture. So then here's so one of the curves does goes back, does zigzag back and forth. Then for the strong Fréchet distance, what the man has to do is has to stand here and let the dog do, so they walk until here together. Then the man stays here and the dog does this walk, and then they continue, right? And now what the weak Fréchet distance does, doesn't really show it too well. These, maybe ignore these little switch. So the weak Fréchet distance lets you walk back. So for the weak Fréchet distance, you can go like this, then the dog continues on his curve, man walks back, and then they continue together. Yeah? So then the monotone path in the free space is replaced by an arbitrary path in the free space from bottom left to top right corner. Okay. So that was so now we have all the ingredients for defining the graph distances. So, and here's what I just already said. I first define the directed from one graph to another graph, and if I want the undirected, I do the same as for the Hausdorff distance. I take the maximum of the two directions. Okay. And here maybe three examples to look at to get a feeling for this measure, and I will also use them to show some properties on the next slide. So here if I want to measure the distance between these two graphs, then they will have a small distance because I can, in either direction, I can map G1 just to one edge here, but I can also map all of G2 onto this one edge of G1. Here I will have a small distance from G2 to G1, because I can map G2 to G1, but I will have a large distance from G1 to G2 because I have to decide to map it either to this side or to this side, because there's a gap here, right? And here this is just a normal example where Fréchet distance and weak Fréchet distance differ, so these will have a small weak Fréchet distance but a large strong Fréchet distance. And this also transfers to the graphs. Question? No? Okay. So I want to tell you about computing these measures, but let me first mention two properties. So the first property that is always nice for distance measures is whether they are metric, and indeed for planar embedded graphs they are. Yeah, but let me just mention this. Then the next question is, so now we defined a new distance measure, and I mean, our hope is that it's useful in the applications I mentioned, but and it also makes sense to compare to the other distance measures we know. And in this case, it makes sense to compare to other distance measures which are also related to the Fréchet distance. And maybe let me just mention this so we can show that well, by definition the weak graph distance is always smaller or equal than the strong graph distance. And then the two other measures which are inspired or related to Fréchet are the contour tree distance and the traversal distance. And we can show that on planar embedded graphs we get this relationship. And actually these are also examples that show that these inequalities can be strict inequalities. Okay, so now the main question is, how difficult is it to compute these distance measures, which is particularly difficult as, for instance, we know that this contour tree distance is NP hard and the traversal distance is polynomial time computable, so how difficult is it to compute these graph distances? And there it turns out that also some variants are NP hard and some variants we can compute in polynomial time. So in general, on general graphs, so the problem is NP hard to compute for both graph distances, strong and weak. If the first graph is a tree, then it can be computed in polynomial time. And then for the weak graph distance and planar embedded graphs with a special property that I will mention on the next one of the next slides, we can compute it in polynomial time. But for the strong graph distance on planar embedded graphs, the problem remains NP complete. Okay, so let me just briefly mention the NP hardness for general graphs. So there's actually very natural reduction from the binary constraint satisfaction problem. So if you know this problem, you will see that this is a very natural reduction. So I'm given, so in the binary constraint satisfaction problem, I'm given a set of variables. Each variable has a discrete domain. And then I have a set of binary constraints, so constraints on two variables, and they tell me which of the which combination of constraint domains are feasible. And yes, I want to choose for each variable one of its to assign it a value of its domain. And this can very easily be transferred to reduced to our graph similarity problem. So all of my variables become vertices of the graph G1, and then in G2 I get a vertex for each of my discretely many domains that I can map it to, and then each constraint gives me an edge of my second graph. Okay, so this first reduction that we did results in G1 and G2 both being having crossings, so not being planar. But then we later or more recently realized that we can also reduce from 3-color validity, and that shows NP hardness where G1 may be planar, and also for any constant approximation, and for curves in higher dimensions. Okay. So let's now turn to the to the algorithmic approach. So by the definition of the graph distance, there's actually a fairly natural approach to computing it, and the steps are listed here. So I want to decide if as before, I'm given a distance epsilon, so I'm solving the decision problem. So I'm given a distance epsilon, and I want to know if I can map G1 to G2 within this distance. So now what do? So here I have some part of my two graphs, so in blue G1 and in red G2. So naturally, I can only map vertices to some part of G2 that is in their epsilon ball. So I consider all of the connected components of G2 that are in the epsilon ball of the vertex. It's a possible placement. And then I get possible placement of my two vertices here. And then I have to map the edges to simple path between these possible placements. So then I can check which of these placements of the vertices are connected by simple path in the graph. And so for instance here these two placements are connected, as are these two. But this would not be a proper connection because it goes outside the epsilon tube. So it's not proper for either the weak or the strong Fréchet distance. And this would only be a proper connection for the weak but not the strong Fréchet distance. But I can check this for all of my placements. I then check with all of the combinations which are valid. And I can do all of that in polynomial time. And then I can also, if I've done that, I will then go and prune all invalid placements. So here I have pruned down to these possible placements because this placement did not connect to anything here, same with this one. And this one is also not valid because it doesn't connect anywhere over here. So for that edge it's not valid. So then the only remaining placements for this edge would be, so for the two vertices of this edge would be those two placements. And then actually at this point I could safely place this one edge. So I can do those first 3 steps in polynomial time, and then after these first 3 steps I know whether I can locally place each vertex in the other graph. But the difficult question is now whether I can place the whole graph. And this this step is not always easy. So it is easy for trees because I can just trivially say if every vertex is placed, then I can also place the whole graph. Then for these planar embedded and spike-free graphs, so that's the extra geometrical constraint that we make, and the weak graph distance, we can also say if every vertex has a placement, we can place the whole graph. But the same does not hold for if I use the strong distance, so the strong Fréchet distance instead of the weak Fréchet distance. Okay, so let me sketch these results. For trees, it's actually very easy because if I have a placement for each vertex, I can just greedily assign placements to all of the adjacent vertices and place the whole graph ACA tree. Then for the planar spike-free graphs and the weak Fréchet distance. So first let me say what a spike is. So a spike, it's visually it's a spike. And more formally, I have 3 consecutive vertices in one graph, such that the ball of the one vertex intersects the tube of the next 2 vertices. Yeah? So, and here, for instance, I have both my G1 and my G2 have spikes. Yeah? And so, if I can assume, or if I know, if my graphs do not have spikes, then actually we can also say that if each vertex has at least one valid placement, then the whole graph has a weakly valid placement. And So the problem are the cycles. Yeah, I have to find consistent mappings on the cycles. And without these spikes, I can define what we call outer placements of each cycle. And then we basically map each cycle to its outer placement. And then if I have two adjacent cycles, then I have to find a consistence mapping for the two. But because of this definition of the outer placement, these two outer placements have to intersect. And then I can merge the mapping of the two cycles into one using these intersections of the outer placements. Yeah, but that only works without spikes. So with spikes and the strong graph distance, it no longer works. So here is an example again of a blue graph G1 that I want to map to the red graph G2. And you can already see that the red graph has several spikes. So the construction is as follows. So now I go back to the strong Fréchet distance, and then I see that I cannot map this. So all of my vertices, all of my vertex placements are locally valid, but there's no valid placement of the whole graph. So why not? Because I have these two cycles, yeah, in G1. And I call the faces F1 and F2, and I have one edge that they share, which I call E, and E has two options, either to be placed including E1 or to be placed including E2, and I can now see that neither is possible. So why are they not possible? So when I map a face, so the cycle of G1, then I have this construction of an inner and an outer circle, but here the spike always forces me to switch from inner to outer. So if I say for E I choose E1, then I go along here, I come from the outer, but I need to switch to the inner. But this brings me into trouble, because then to map now F2, I would also have to go to the outer here, and then I only come in here. And this construction, these spikes are, so these vertices are just outside the ball, so I cannot use these spikes fully for the strong Fréchet distance. Okay, so I cannot map this whole graph, so and I also cannot find these outer placements here. And this example basically also leads to an NP hardness reduction for the strong graph distance. So this spiky construction here is actually basically our variable construction. In the class sketch it's a bit more complicated, but the idea is basically this. So now we have that the distance is polynomial time computable only for the weak distance with the spike-free graphs, but not for the strong distance. And so what we saw is that the problem becomes hard because of the spikes, the crossings. So so two natural questions that remained were, one is that so is this problem still hard for the weak graph distance if the graph has spikes? And so something that we just recently worked on is to realize that yes, it stays NP hard with the spikes, and it actually follows in the following way. So the strong and the weak graph distance only differ in the distance of an edge to a path. And actually what we can do is we can, even in this example, or more formally in the NP hardness proof, we can add vertices to the first graph, such that then the weak graph distance gets the same value as the strong graph distance. And then if we do that, we get spikes in both graphs. So G2 already has spikes, but if we, and in this example, but in our gadgets, and then by inserting these vertices, we get that the weak graph distance equals the strong graph distance, but the first graph gets spikes, and then both graphs have spikes, and the NP hardness still holds. So that was the one question that was still open. The other question is, so okay, obviously, so can it be fixed parameter tractable in the number of crossings? So already our reduction showed that with a constant number of crossings, it's NP hard. But if we don't only use the number of crossings in G2, but also the number of edges in G1 that are close to crossings in G2, then we can think of a device an FPT algorithm where basically, I mean, if I have a crossing in G2 and an edge in G1, then I make decisions on which edge of the crossing the edge of G1 is mapped to. And then I still have to map the remainder, but yes. So let me briefly finish by going back to my motivation of comparing geometric reconstructions of road networks. So here's two other algorithms, two of the many map reconstruction algorithms. So they both reconstructed a part of Chicago on the same data set. And as you can see here, so these reconstructions, I mean, they both got the same data set, but they actually look quite different. So first of all, the algorithm by Ahmed et al. Reconstructed a lot more than the other algorithm, but also made more geometric errors, like there are lots of these zags that Ahmed did, where the Davis construction seems to be more geometrically precise. So we can, yeah, and okay. So now an interesting question is how can we use our distance measure to actually measure the quality of these reconstructions? So first of all, obviously, I mean, there's a lot of factors involved here, and it's not just the geometric distance between the ground truth and the graph. So we should also take into account how much of the graph was reconstructed. But this is one, I mean, we can use this as one quality measure for comparing these reconstructions. Okay, with that, I would like to conclude. So I told you about our distance measures on geometric graphs and how to compute them. And there are still some open questions. Definitely one open question is how to actually use these in practice. So that would definitely require more elaborate analysis and evaluation, and probably also faster algorithms if we want to run it on really big data sets. Okay, thank you.
Nice. So let me understand. So you are reconstructing also topology, not only geometry or only geometry?
What again?
What are you reconstructing? Geometry and topology, or only one?
We are reconstructing a geometric graph, so that has a topology and a geometry, I would say. What do you mean with reconstructing topology?
But then you have to define what is topology, because on a graph.
Okay, so I think I informally use topology to mean here
the combinatorial structure.
Yes, thank you. That would have been the better
So
word, yes.
so you're reconstructing combinatorial structure exactly, or only approximately?
No, I mean,
exactly.
no, I would like to compute it, to reconstruct it exactly, but I mean that's a question for the map construction algorithm. But it actually, like in this very first example that I showed you, with this one four-way crossing. So if you have this one four-way crossing, and so you have a lot of trajectories going like this, and like this, and then so what a lot of these map constructions, what our map construction algorithm does, it does the subtrajectory clustering that Anna also told you, but the subtrajectory clustering will split at this intersection, and then it later also has to connect in the same way. So it should do this correctly, but yes. So that's in, yeah.
So there is no algorithm known even for planar graphs to construct exactly.
I think the problem is that the trajectory data, I mean, we always work on this trajectory data, and the trajectory data, I mean, we can never assume it, I mean, it's never correct. There's a lot of uncertainty in this trajectory data, right? There will be a lot of, yes. So from the trajectory data.
But even theoretical,
Yes.
forget about uncertainty.
Yeah.
I don't think, is there, do you know, any algorithm which can do it exactly in linear time? Probably not. Right? Yeah.
Yes.
Given sampling conditions.
I mean, I would.
We don't know, right?
I would claim that. Good question. I would.
Okay.
Yes, it's good. Yes.
Thank you for the talk. So I'm trying to understand the spike-free graph. So you said since the spike, if the circle bisects the of the following vertices.
Mhm.
So if I split the edge and it's not the next one anymore, then
But-
doesn't that still make a problem? So
Yeah, but then if you split which edge?
if you go to the picture, the first one, so then it's not the next edge, but some later edge.
But they will still be, I think wherever you intersect it, they will still intersect.
You still find a spike,
Yes, exactly.
even if you subdivide these edges.
Yes, so I mean,
No matter what. Okay, so it's
if I go anywhere here, I mean, you have also this tube, and
Ah.
there will still be intersections.
okay.
But actually, yeah,
Okay.
good point,
So
but
it's
yes,
a very local condition that it's a five.
very local
Okay.
conditions.
So maybe I didn't understand this right. So for the vertex placement, so is the neighborhood kind of is uniform for all vertices in the graph, or
So-
does changing that simplify?
Yeah, I mean, as an analyst talk, I'm using a fixed distance threshold. So I'm asking for mapping within a fixed distance threshold, and then this gives me this neighborhood. Yeah, but of course, if I shrink and grow the neighborhood, they will change. For instance, my vertex placements will grow together. Yeah, I mean, if I grow my epsilon, then for instance, these two placements grow together, and this might become possible. So what I'm doing here is always for a fixed distance threshold. We haven't actually, yeah.
I guess different neighborhoods for local roads versus highways and so on.
Yes, that's actually a good point. So actually the map reconstruction algorithms, some of them try to do that. In this distance measure, we haven't tried that so far, but you're right, that would make sense, yes.
Thank you. You said you have you can run in polynomial time on trees, and so a natural question for some people, I don't know much about this, but a natural question for some people is, what about graphs with small tree width?
I haven't thought about it at all. Good question. Do street networks have small tree widths? People here know?
There are roughly very large trees.
Yeah, the grids. Yes. It's still a natural question. So can we get this from trees to anywhere? But the problem is, as soon as we have,
Any more questions? Okay, let's thank the speaker once again with a small token of appreciation. Hi everyone, welcome back to the session. In this session, we'll hear from Professor Matthew Katz. He's affiliated with Ben Gurion University of Negev, Israel. His research interests spans across computational geometry, issues in computer graphics, facility location, layout of VLSI circuits, and computational molecular biology. Today, we'll hear him speak about shrink and bifurcate optimization techniques. Please join me in welcoming Professor Matthew.
Thank you. I guess I need to update my website. Computational geometry, computational biology, not anymore. So, thank you for inviting me. I'd like to tell you about an optimization technique which we call shrink and bifurcate. So, originally it appears in a paper from 2014, actually, from Sausage 2014, in which we used it for in a very restricted form on a somewhat esoteric problem, Fréchet distance with shortcuts. And only about 7 years later, we realized that the ideas in that paper are much more general and can be applied in many other cases. And last year in ESA, we presented the technique in its full generality. So I will present it along with an example. So let P be a set of endpoints in the plane, and R a real parameter. So we define the graph GR, which is the graph on P, where there is an edge between 2 points, P and Q, if and only if the distance between them is at most 2R. So this is the 2R, so this is the graph that we get in this case. And of course, this is equivalent to the unit disk graph, where the unit here is R. So if we draw a disk around each point of radius R, we define the unit disk graph to be the intersection graph. So there is an edge between two centers if and only if the corresponding disks intersect. So this is the unit disk graph. And we consider the so-called reverse shortest path problem. So in this problem, we're given the set P of points. In addition, we're given two designated points, S and T, and an integer parameter K. And the goal is to compute the smallest value, smallest distance, R star, such that the graph on P with the R star as the distance contains a path from S to T with at most K edges. So for example, if K is 5, then this is our R, then these are the disks, and this is the graph that is induced by these disks, the intersection graph, and this graph contains a path from between S and T of length exactly 5, so that's good. And of course, our goal is to find the minimum radius for which this property holds. So in this case, it does not. And often when we consider optimization problems, there is the corresponding decision version. So in the decision version, in this case, the decision version, we are given a specific value R, a specific distance, and we need to determine whether the graph for this distance has the desired property. In our case, contains a path of length at most K from S to T. And okay, so if, for example, for this specific R, the shortest path in terms of number of edges is of length 7, and we need to compare it with K. If it is at most K, then the answer is yes. If it is larger than K, the answer is no. So in this case, the decision, there exists a very efficient decision algorithm because we can run BFS, breadth first search, from the point S and return yes if T is reached within K steps of the search. And for unit disk graph, BFS can be implemented very efficiently in order of n log n time, where n is the number of points. So the graph may contain a quadratic number of edges, of course, but still BFS in unit disk graphs can be implemented in order of n log n time. Okay. So let's make two observations for the optimization problem. The first is that
This is the only place you have used the unit-based structure so far. Like you could have done it for general graphs, albeit with
right.
bigger.
I'm just using it as an example. I'll give more applications later. So first of all, it is clear that R star, the desired value, is half the distance between some pair of points in P. And so we have our critical values in this problem are the n choose 2 interpoint distances. And another observation is that the property that the graph contains the desired path is monotone in R. So if it is true for a specific R, then if we increase the value, the distance, then it is definitely true. Okay, so usually in optimization problems, if there exists an efficient solution to the decision problem, then this is usually good news because it means often we can apply a known optimization techniques such as parametric search or other techniques to obtain a solution to the optimization problem with running time which is roughly the same as the running time needed for the decision algorithm. So in this case, the hope is that we can obtain an algorithm for the optimization time for the optimization problem of running time near linear in N. But one of the requirements of parametric search is that the decision algorithm, it should have a parallel version. So it must be parallelizable in a weak sense. But this is clearly not true for BFS, which is inherently sequential. So we cannot apply in this case parametric search, nor any of the other optimization techniques. So how do we approach this problem? So the naive solution, of course, is to compute all the order of n square distances and perform a binary search among them using the decision algorithm to resolve comparisons. A slightly better semi-naive solution is to use distance selection. So we don't want to explicitly compute all the order of n square critical values. We use a distance selection algorithm which given a value k between 1 and n choose 2 returns the kth largest distance among the induced by the points. The running time of distance selection is n to the 4/3, and now we can use distance selection and perform a binary search using the decision algorithm, and the running time of the optimization algorithm will be roughly n to the 4/3. But this was improved. It was improved by Wang and Zhao, who gave n to the power 5/4 solution. And then it turns out that by applying the shrink and bifurcate technique, we can improve it even further to n to the power 6/5. Okay, so now I want to give a high-level description of the optimization technique. So it consists of two stages, the shrink stage and the bifurcate stage. So in the shrink stage, we're given some parameter L, which we will determine later, but it's some n to the power epsilon for epsilon less than 1. And the goal is to return an interval I on the line such that the following two conditions hold. First of all, this interval should contain the desired value, R star. And the second condition is that the number of critical values in this interval should be at most L. So we know that along the line we have n choose 2 critical values, and now we want an interval I which contains much less critical values, only at most L critical values, but R star must be one of them. Okay, and this turns out, I'm not going to go into details describing this stage, because this stage, it is done by batch train searching techniques, and the main idea is we just stop the process at some point in the middle, and then we can show that we found such an interval. So we don't execute the entire process. We stop at some point in the middle, and we can claim that we found such an I, and the running time in our example is this. So it's an expected time. It's n to the 4/3 over L to the 1/3. So this is the shrink stage. Now I want to go to describe in more detail the bifurcate stage. So in the bifurcate stage, what we do, we try to simulate the decision algorithm for R star. Of course, R star is not known at this point, but we start running it, executing the decision algorithm, and during the execution, the decision algorithm will generate critical values, such as R prime here, and we will need to compare R prime with R star. We will need to determine whether R prime is smaller or greater than R star, or perhaps equal to R star. Okay, so notice that if...
But we can't use the monotonic property.
Yeah. So if R star falls to the left of the interval I, yes.
One question is that, so in the shrink phase, all these critical values that we have, we don't actually have, this is after the case. So how do we implement the shrink of these points on the line? These points are the different...
The output is just the interval. And we know for this interval, we know that it contains the R star, and it contains at most L, in total, at most L critical values.
But how do we get this information?
We don't compute them explicitly.
So this is
We just know that we have such an interval. Okay. So now, if the decision algorithm, for example, tries to compare R prime with R star, then if we are lucky and R prime falls to the left of I, then we know the result. R prime must be smaller than R star. And the same if R prime falls to the right of I. In this case, R prime is greater than R star. The problem is what happens when R prime falls in the interval, and then we don't know the relation between R prime and R star. So in this case, we bifurcate. So we split. So we split I into two intervals, a left interval and a right interval, where the splitting point is at R prime. And we continue the execution of the decision algorithm under both assumptions. So on the left, we assume that R star falls in this region, so it is smaller than R prime, and we continue the execution, the simulated execution of the decision algorithm under this assumption. And on the right, we assume that R prime falls here, so it is greater, not R star, sorry, R star falls here, so it is greater than R prime, and we continue the simulation of the decision algorithm under this assumption. So in this way, eventually, we keep on bifurcating, and in this way we construct a binary tree. We call it a bifurcation tree, but we pause the execution after we have bifurcated k times for some parameter k. So after k bifurcations, we pause the execution. So let's see what's the situation at the point where we pause. So we have such a tree, and at the leaves of the tree we have these intervals, which actually partition the original interval into k sub-intervals. And each of these partition points is a critical value. It's one of the distances, it's a distance between a pair of points. So now, what do we do now? So now we run the unsimulated decision algorithm. We perform a binary search among these values, k values, with the unsimulated decision algorithm to locate R star among these critical values. So this costs like log n times the running time of the unsimulated decision algorithm, which is the order of n log n. And once we locate R star among these critical values, we know that this is the only relevant leaf. So we can continue the execution from this leaf, and we know that R star indeed lies in this yellow interval between Ri and Ri plus 1, and we can forget about all the other leaves, all the other leaves and nodes that we generated during this process. Okay, so this actually only describes the first round of the simulation. So in general, in the bifurcation stage, we have this loop in which we simulate the decision algorithm at R star. So we in each round of the loop, in each iteration, we construct this bifurcation tree, pause after k bifurcations, perform a binary search among the order of k critical values that were generated, and now we can restrict ourselves to a sub-interval and repeat. And we do so until we end the execution, until the execution ends. So in terms of running time, we get that the running time of this stage is root n times n. Okay, the first term is more easy to explain, just since we begin with L critical values, and in each round we generate k critical values, so we have like L over k rounds, and in each round we need to perform a binary search with the unsimulated decision algorithm, which takes roughly linear time. The other term is, I skipped some details which explain the other term. Anyway, so the running time for this stage is root n times n. And recall that we began with the interval shrinking stage whose running time was this. So the total running time is the sum of these two terms, and if we balance them, then we get n to the 6/5. In this case, L turns out to be n to the power 2/5. So, okay, so this is the technique. And there are, in the meantime, we found many more applications. These are only a few of them. So first of all, we can also do it for weighted unit disk graphs. And moreover, we can do the reverse shortest path in additively weighted arbitrary disk graphs. We can also I will show more, but we can also do proximity graphs of these joint segments, and this is a more interesting example because it's of a different flavor. We can also solve the RSP reverse shortest path invisibility graphs of towers over a terrain. I'll show in a minute. So consider the case of weighted arbitrary disks. So in this case, the input is a set of disks, and now R is an additive term. So when we extend the radius of each of the disks by R. So this gives us this set of disks and the corresponding intersection graph. And okay, so this is the intersection graph, and we also define the weight here of an edge in the graph. The weight is simply the distance between the two corresponding centers. So now in this setting, the RSP problem is defined as follows. So we have our set of disks, and again we have two special disks, ds and dt, and we are also given a weight, w. And now the goal is to find the smallest r star, such that the corresponding graph contains a path between ds and dt, between these two disks, of total weight at most w. So here the total weight is just the sum of the weights of the edges. So this is one example. And in general, once we are given this technique, shrink and bifurcate technique, the goal or the challenge in most of the problems is to come up with an efficient implementation of either breadth first search or Dijkstra's algorithm. And so this becomes the main challenge, because once we have this, we can almost automatically apply the shrink and bifurcate algorithm to get an intermediate, to get a good result, relatively. Yes?
Please go back to the slide describing this technique where you are forming the tree, decision tree. So here the unsimulated decision algorithm, it would also, so R prime is the value for which the unsimulated algorithm would want to know the answer.
Right.
The simulated algorithm just divides into two possibilities.
Right. I mean, you could run the unsimulated decision algorithm on R prime, but that would be too expensive. You want to first accumulate. You want to accumulate a set of critical values and then run binary search among them with the unsimulated decision algorithm.
But but this R prime is the same R prime for which the unsimulated algorithm, when you were running it for R star,
Yeah.
it would have wanted to know what is the answer with respect to R.
Right.
But does it really happen in the BFS? The BFS divides into grids of R star and does something.
No, it does happen. You are right that there are some other, there might be other critical values which are unrelated to interpoint distances, which would show up, and we need to be able to handle them. I didn't mention it, but the main critical values that show up are these interpoint distances. Okay, so let me move forward. So where were we? Oh, I'm moving back. Okay, so here is another example. in this case, so I'll go over this very briefly. So the input here is a set of disjoint segments, and why disjoint? Because there is strong evidence that if we consider intersecting segments, then one cannot implement BFS in near linear time. Probably it will need something like n to the 4/3. So, but for disjoint segments, we managed to implement BFS in near linear time. The problem here is, again, so given a set S of n disjoint segments, two segments S and T, and a parameter K, find the smallest R star such that the graph contains a path between S and T with at most K edges. So this is equivalent to drawing these arenas around the segments, and whenever two arenas intersect, it means that there is an edge in the graph between the two segments. And the last, the last application that I would like to mention is for visibility graphs of visibility graph of towers over a terrain. So here we have a 1.5D terrain. So this is the polygonal X monotone polygonal line T in the figure, and we have a set Q of M points on the terrain. So these are the blue points here, and we, for 2 points, Qi and Qj, the critical value that they determine is the minimum height of a tower that we need to erect at Qi and at Qj, such that the tips of these towers see each other. So again, we have a quadratic number of critical values, but in this example, the critical value also depends on the terrain T. So in this sense, it is different than the previous examples. And the problem in this case is so we're given the terrain, a set of points, K, and the goal is to find the minimum height H star, such that if we construct a tower of height H star at each of the points, then the visibility graph that is induced by the tip of the towers, this is the graph in red, contains the desired path. So it contains a path of length, etc. Yes?
Can you see through towers?
Yes, you can see through towers, but two towers see each other if and only if the line segment between the tips of the towers lies above the polygonal line. It might go pass through a vertex of the terrain, but it cannot go below.
Sorry, so maybe I would like, as in, like, can the visibility go through a tower?
I think the answer is yes.
Yes. You're asking whether these poles are, can I see through them?
Yes.
Yes, the answer is yes. Yes. Okay, that's it. Thank you. Yeah.
I have 3 questions, I think. First, I remember there's quite an old algorithm for parametric search where the idea was generic parametric search, where the parallel algorithm is not the algorithm for the problem you're trying to solve, and it's just some generic algorithm that you can run in parallel.
Yeah.
And then you use the sequential algorithm for the decisions that you need.
Right, but I'm not aware of such an algorithm in this case.
I can't remember exactly the details, but
No. That's true. That's correct.
It seems like something, if it exists, that would be relevant.
Right.
Second, what about? I wonder whether K-connected RSP is an interesting problem. That is a robust RSP, where instead of wanting one connectivity, you want edge disjoint connectivity or vertex disjoint connectivity by multiple paths.
Yeah.
You choose a parameter.
So,
Does that change the problem at all?
it might make it more difficult, but it sounds interesting.
And then third, when you're doing the simulation and you're building this tree of bifurcations,
Right.
do you use persistence or do you simulate forward and then work backward? Because presumably you have some algorithm state that you have to maintain as you go down each of those paths.
Right, so I didn't go into details when I described it. So we proceed down a path, but we don't go to, if we do too much work along this path, or or if it becomes too long, then we jump to another location. And there is a lot of bookkeeping there, and also you need to take account of the additional work that is performed. It's not necessarily that in each step you need to bifurcate or things like that. So that was the additional term that I didn't explain.
Yeah. We could talk later about the bookkeeping.
Sure,
I'm just
sure.
sort of interested
Okay.
in the mechanics.
Like, say you were happy with approximations, that is, instead of the exact K, you like something that's like a bi-criterion approximation. Is that something?
We didn't think about it, but of course it's an interesting version.
Like for dynamic thing, like, so there's a lot of activity these days for like maintaining a shortest path as, like in your case, like these disks or points are added or deleted. So is that something that has been looked at?
Not in this context, I think.
So the general shortest path is
It's not.
So here you talked about applications for reverse shortest path. It's not enough with some Fréchet variants. Can you
Right.
formulate like a abstract theorem saying if you have a problem of this type, you can do this and this and this way, then this is what you get.
So I think I wouldn't call it a theorem, but in general, if you have an optimization problem, you have an efficient solution to the decision version, which is not parallelizable. So it is like BFS, inherently sequential. And then you may want to consider this.
The sort of
Technique.
extra bookkeeping and the other things are so problem specific that you.
Some of them are problem specific, but they never really, there are difficulties that you need to overcome, but we didn't encounter, as of now, a problem that we couldn't apply the technique to.
But you don't
Because-
expect that, like in parametric search, where you can state such a theorem, that here this doesn't quite work.
I would need to think what exactly are the conditions in this theory.
We can have a couple of more questions.
My question is that unsimulated version of the decision algorithm, it does not start with comparing with some R prime. It starts with making grids of R star by root 2 or something, right?
Unsimulated?
The
Unsimulated, it just proceeds like it starts from S, it
yes,
finds all its neighbors within distance R from S.
yes,
And-
yes. But
Yeah.
there's no comparison with R prime in the beginning, right?
No.
So where does R prime come into the picture? Because we are just trying to simulate that decision algorithm, right?
Right, but you need to compute distances, right? Whenever you compute a distance, you generate a critical value.
Yeah, but the n-log algorithm is not just that, right? It starts with making these grids
No, no, but okay. So assume you are running your decision algorithm with R star.
Right.
And now you want to know whether to draw an edge from the current point to another point. So you compute the distance. The distance is R prime. Now, in order to know whether to add it to in the next step of the BFS, you need to compare it with R star.
Yes, but the efficient algorithm does not do that, right? It divides the grid into blocks of R star
Right. But
and enumerates the points inside the grid. The uses hashing, right? So
no hashing. Not the one that I'm thinking about. It's yeah, but it does right. It cannot do the naive BFS because the naive BFS its running time depends on the number of edges, and here we want it to depend only on the number of vertices. But this is known. I mean, there are algorithms that do that. They lay a grid and they compute low envelopes of this.
So, if I understood correctly, everything generalizes to higher dimensions and so on, right? But will there be any dependency of the dimension in this string and bifurcated process?
Yeah, I mean the exponent will grow because, like for example, if we in the plane we get something between linear and n to the 4/3, which is n to the 6/5. Now, if you like do it in 3D, then the equivalent of n to the 4/3 would be n to the 3/2. So you will get something between n and n to the 3/2. In this case, it would be n to the 5/4. So there is this dependency. Yes.
Let's thank the speaker once again.
Thank you.
We have a small section of For our next speaker, we have Professor Neeldhara Mishra. She's affiliated with Indian
Like doing his homework.
Indeed, indeed.
Try to this late in the day.
Well, Arindam said people are going to be tired at the end of a long day, so I'm going to speak very little, but maybe we can have fun doing things with our hands. So, well, thank you, Aditi, for the very kind introduction, and thanks to the organizers for having me here. I'm sorry if my voice is a little weirder than usual. Just trying to recover from a sore throat, so please bear with me. All right, so I'm also sorry, but the abstract was a little vague because I was between doing fold cut and hinge dissections, both of which I think are really cool puzzles and ideas to play with. I finally settled on the cut because that means I can outsource most of it to you. So let's see how this goes. So the question that we will try and talk about is what shapes can you get out of single cut? And I should probably make the disclaimer that I'm not really a geometry person, maybe an tentatively aspiring geometry person, but I'm just going to talk about things that I've found cool, that I've read about. So I'm hoping that over the breaks you can tell me more about how the stuff actually works. So thank you. All right, so this basically goes back to, I think, one of Demain et al.'s first computational origami papers. And it's not really going to be frontiery work. This goes back to the late 90s, and there have been some developments since. But I think the first paper came out in Fun 98, I think. And we're going to talk about what the problem setup is, but there is a very nice page that summarizes the state of the art and what's known. So if you want to find out more, that's one place to go. If it's a cool math theorem, there's a good chance there's a number file video about it. So there is indeed one. And this one here actually talks about doing fold cut for all letters of the alphabet. So it's kind of nice if you follow along and you want to cut out your name, you can probably do that. The second method that we'll basically not talk about very much is something that's explained in a lot of detail in this book, which for anyone who needs it is also available in Japanese now, so geometric folding algorithms. And I should also credit folks at the Center for Creative Learning at IIT Gandhinagar who have a lot of foldy-cutty nerds, and that's where I found out about this problem, partly, or at least a little bit about the solution anyway. So they have a lot of cool puzzles as well, and I'll show you a couple of them at the end. Okay, so what is the basic setup of the fold cut puzzle? So it's activity in 3 acts. So in the first part, you take a piece of paper and fold it flat. Then you run one single complete straight cut through what you folded, and then you unfold the pieces. You see that the paper falls apart, you unfold the pieces. Somewhere in my bag I have some of my fold cut practice, so I'll show you when we are done, I guess. So yeah, but this is what happens in the fold cut setup. And the question that you might want to ask is, what kind of shapes can you make out of this process, right? And the game version of this is, I give you a shape, can you recreate it using this process, which is what you're presumably doing now. So I have given you a couple of full cut targets. So there's a butterfly, and there's a checkerboard pattern that goes back to Martin Gardner. So I'll show you that in a minute. So yeah, let me just maybe give you a little bit of story about where this started. I think the oldest known reference, according to at least Demain's lecture on this topic, which I think is fairly authoritative, is back in the early 1700s. I'm not even going to try to butcher that pronunciation, but it's a Japanese puzzle book. I believe it translates to math problems, contest problems, or something like this. And you see that little, this little shape out here. I think the instructions are to basically cut the shape out after making a bunch of folds. So this is a traditional Japanese emblem, and here is a modern attempt at somebody cutting this out, single fold, single cut, multiple folds. Yeah? Okay, so there is an urban legend about a seamstress impressing George Washington by showing how she could fold a piece of cloth and cut out a star in one shot. And apparently she believed that you could only do it for the 5-pointed stars. So that's apparently why the American flag has 5-pointed stars. So not completely clear if this is an authentic story, but it's a story nonetheless, which is cool. There's been magicians who've been interested in folding cutting business. So Houdini, before doing the escape stunts, apparently liked to perform fold and cut, which features in his book Paper Magic. Not entirely clear why this book is in the spirituality section of Amazon.in, but well, you never know, right? So, okay, as chances are that the book was ghostwritten by another magician, Walter Gibson, but this book features a few fold cut ideas. This is a much more in-depth book, also by a magician, Gerald Lowe, where he talks about cutting out all kinds of cool things, sometimes with a single cut, sometimes more. And Martin Gardner, and I think this is like the third in a series of Scientific American collected articles. So New Mathematical Diversions features paper cutting, and Gardner actually refers to paper capers, and he's clearly impressed that Lowe could cut out all the letters of the alphabet, a string of stars, all kinds of things. And this is probably the first place that somewhere down here Gardner explicitly poses the question of what are all the shapes that you can cut out in this fashion. Okay, so the checkerboard thing that you have is also from Gardner. It's mentioned right here. All right, so, okay, let's do, then I also have blank sheets of paper to go around if anybody would like them for extra practice. But, okay, if you were to just cut out a square, yeah, so let's do some super easy examples, because that's basically anything more is above my pay grade, so let's stick to the easy examples. So if you had to cut out a square, how would you do it? Yeah, so you could probably fold it along both the diagonals and do it that way. I actually, the first time I was doing it was this more, it's more rookie style, where I would fold it across, like it goes across again, and then you're forced to do the diagonal thing. And that works too, but it's a larger number of folds. So you could also think about, well, not only can you do it, but can you do it with the fewest number of folds, which actually has practical relevance, because the more you fold, as you will find, the harder it is to cut through all those layers of paper. And sometimes it's a single cut only in theory. It's really hard to get through in real life. But pro tip for those of you who want to actually become professional folder cutters, you can use a variety of papers that's super thin and maybe even slightly translucent, that helps you see the lines better, and when you fold them out, it's not unmanageably thick. Okay. All right, so that's a square. How about if you just had two parallel lines and you had to line them up and cut them out? Just the two parallel lines, and so I'm not cutting out a closed shape, but I just want to fold the paper in such a way that the two lines are cut and nothing else is cut. Like the scissors don't touch anything other than the lines. Right. Yeah, so physically you can imagine that you have the sheet of paper and you have these two lines. You just try to hang on to one for dear life and get the other one to just line up and fold. But when you do that fold, it turns out that the line that's the crease is, as some of you have realized, the angular bisector between the two lines once you extend them. Yeah, so that makes sense. So extend these lines. I drew that by hand, it's probably not the angular bisector, but angular bisector does this. So this works. How about if you had to cut out a triangle of any type? So what would be the general approach?
Fold it and reduce to the case before?
Fold it and reduce to the case before, exactly right. It feels like you should just be able to, you have three pairs of line segments now, and just do the pairwise angular bisectors, and that's pretty much it. It's just that I think if you just draw out the three angular bisectors, you will see that they meet at this point in the center. And if you were to just squish up the paper along those lines, then you're not going to get a flat folding. So you just have to be, I guess, a little more careful in how you actually execute it. But that's pretty much the spirit for the triangle that actually, as it turns out, for almost any shape. So, so this is the cool theorem. It basically says that you can give me any set of line segments on a plane, an idealized sheet of paper. There's always a folding pattern that folds the paper flat, and there exists a single cut that touches only those line segments, nothing else. And think, pretty remarkable. And it turns out that there's not one but two approaches to proving this, and maybe more if you folks want to think about it after the session, but at least two. So talk about the first one, which uses straight skeletons. I'm not going to be awfully formal about this. I'll just give you the main idea, which is, I mean, essentially your first thought might actually be, why not, where you have a set of line segments on the plane, we know how to get two line segments to align. That's by creasing along the angular bisector. So just take pairwise line segments until you've run out of them, and you would have gotten everything to align. But as it turns out, when you're looking at a very general picture, you could run into all kinds of edge cases where, like I said, even with the triangle, you might run into an issue. You have to be careful about whether the creasing, which of the creases are the so-called mountain, which are the valleys, and in which order you're going to do the creasing. Is everything going to finally, I mean, everything will, it seems intuitive that everything will finally line up, but the fact that the paper stays flat, that's something that still requires a bit of an argument. And I guess if this was just the algorithm, take a pair of segments, fold along the angular bisector, you probably have to also technically argue termination, or you're probably not creating new scenarios for yourself as you go along. So this is basically it, except, okay, so we're basically going to discover the angular bisectors by using what is called the straight skeleton, which is probably a standard object that you folks deal with, but I only know about it in this context, so I will just describe it in any case the way I understand it informally. So let's say you have a shape, which is the easiest context in which I can describe the skeleton. Basically what we are going to do is really scrunch up the shape and basically make copies of it that are shrinking. We just did a little bit of shrinking and bifurcating in the previous talk here. We're only going to shrink. So we're going to make copies of the shape concentrically. Well, basically, we're going to go like that, make copies that go deeper in until the shape completely vanishes. And we're going to do the same going out. So in some sense, you are shrinking the outer space whatever's outside by pushing the shape outwards, right? And what you do once you have the shrinking and the expanding of the basic shape, what you do is you keep track of where the corner points are going across the copies. So in this case, if you look at this corner point, it goes ta-da like that and like that. Okay, so if you draw that line, and if you draw all of these lines, you end up rediscovering essentially the angular bisectors. Okay, and you can do it with messier shapes, but it turns out that this skeleton profile basically brings back your angular bisectors. And at this point, you could say, well, fold along the skeleton, but and this is, in this case, a simple example of a square. It turns out that you can, I don't know if this is a projected distortion or it's probably not really a square, but okay, let's imagine that it's a square. In this case of the square, things line up nicely, and the skeleton in particular is easy to fold against, but sometimes you will end up having more complex skeletons where the vertices of the skeleton have high degree, and they will not fold flat if you just fold it against the skeleton. So you have to do a little more work and drop some perpendicular bisectors from these skeletons down to the nearest edges. So you get another set of lines, and this, it turns out, you can prove it always leads to a flat folding where everything lines up and you can cut it out. Okay, so this is basically what I said. You have to worry about, like, the skeletons seem promising because they recover the angular bisectors for you, but then why not just do the angular bisectors? Turns out you may not always get a flat out folding, so the skeleton gives you a little bit of a guideline for some additional fixing that you have to do for the whole thing to actually work in the most general case. Okay, so all right, that's the high level idea of the skeleton method. Let me talk very, very briefly about the second method, which is the so-called disk packing method. So here the idea is to take your sheet of paper and the shape that you want to cut out and superimpose a disk packing on it, which has the following properties. So the disks may touch, but they do not overlap. The gaps between the disks have 3 or 4 sides. Maybe this will be clearer with an example. But the main thing is that there's a disk centered at each vertex of the cut pattern, and the radii of the disc, the cut pattern can be seen as the union of the radii of the discs in the packing. Okay, again, should be clearer with a picture. So let's say this is the shape that you're trying to cut out. The reason I picked this very specific shape is because it appears in the paper. I couldn't recreate this for myself, an arbitrary shape, but the shape is essentially stolen from the paper. Now let's pack these discs on it. They do have more or less the properties that we said. We said the discs may not overlap, they're allowed to touch, which is the case. We have a disc centered at every vertex of the shape that we are trying to cut. And again, done a little bit by hand, so maybe not precise, but hopefully you're convinced that the shape can be seen as the radii of the discs here. So these discs here also give us some hints for how we might come up with a folding. So it turns out that you can add edges between the centers of the touching discs, and you get a collection of triangles and quadrangles, and that decomposition of the plane leads to what are called molecules in origami land. These are smaller foldings that you can do that fit into a bigger picture. It was completely meaningless to say without more context, but turns out basically the idea is that when you connect the centers of the discs in this particular packing, you get little pieces that turn out to be almost modularly foldable. And turns out there are a lot of edge cases in this one, which is why I think even the authors say read it from the book and not the paper, because I think the paper glosses over a bunch of details. I haven't gotten to the point where I can appreciate that, but we can appreciate the picture where you basically look at how you might presumably fold this one out. As per intel from the folks who devised both methods, the disk packing one has nicer guarantees in terms of the number of folds. So it's a theoretically better approach, it turns out. However, in practice, apparently you get a lot of ugliness for a lot of the shapes that they try to avoid, and the skeleton packing method is apparently much simpler to work with for the vast majority of shapes that you might want to cut out. So all the folding patterns that you see on the FoldCut website are all done using the skeleton method. Okay, very nearly out of time. I'll quickly wrap up with a few variations of the basic theme. You could go beyond straight cuts. So here is half a heart, and this is from an activity called Cutting Out Hearts, which sounds a little depressing, but it's actually a very fun activity. This got the MoMath Prize for math education activities, and here are some pictures from the description. So you basically give out these puzzles. Students are expected to fold to a point where you can do the half heart cut and basically cut out the hearts that are drawn. And the examples get progressively more challenging, as you can imagine. There are a few more even after this, which I'm not showing. But okay, those are some examples. This is one from CCL. They made this during Diwali this year, and essentially you cut this out, and it's 3 puzzles in one. For every logo, it's possible to fold this thing in such a way that you get a much smaller triangle with just that logo on the front and the back. So there are 3 basic patterns, and you can fold the thing in such a way that you obliterate all the other ones except the one you're interested in. It's also interesting to think about. They have a lot of these like X puzzles in one. So it's a nice constraint problem to think about how you make sure that everything's simultaneously satisfiable on a single sheet of paper. So I think that's pretty cool. One question that I've been curious about but haven't found the answer to is this issue of the number of folds being unmanageable in general. So what if I say I find cutting to be sometimes harder than the folding, so I'm willing to make multiple cuts, but I don't want to fold too many times. So I give you a budget for the number of folds, and I say I allow you P cuts, can you cut out the shape with at most Q folds? So if you know that there is a way of figuring this out, please let me know. I think Akanksha and I have talked about this in the past, and we didn't find a solution, at least as of then, so it would be nice to know. And I will stop with this one. If anyone can cut out FSTTCS, which is happening in a few days, I will, I don't know, give you a coffee mug or something. So I think doing the entirety is going to be super hard because typically when you have like narrow patches like that, it tends to get like annoying. Demains cut out the MIT logo, and that was already super frustrating because of those little tiny things that were clinky between the letters. But even if you give me a solution that does individual letters separately or something, I'd still be super happy. So with that, I think I'm practically out of time. I hopefully didn't overstep. I will stop here. Thanks so much for bearing with me here. Thank you.